So let's do chapter 7 real quick. Okie doke. Photosynthesis. Alright, so there's a star beside this slide. So all life on Earth depends on solar energy, which we explored in chapter 6. So photosynthetic organisms like algae, plants, and cyanobacteria transform solar energy into the chemical energy of carbs. These things, algae, plants, and cyanobacteria, they're called autotrophs because they make their own food. Humans are heterotrophs because something else feeds us. We are not automatic autotrophs like algae, plants, and cyanobacteria. So photosynthesis is a process that captures this solar energy, transforms that solar energy into chemical energy, and then this chemical energy ends up being stored as a carb. So photosynthesizers produce food energy. They feed themselves as well as heterotrophs, and then that's what we are. Heterotrophs are also known as consumers, aka we do not feed ourselves. Both autotrophs and heterotrophs use organic molecules produced by photosynthesis as a source of chemical energy to do cellular work. All that's saying is that we use what photosynthesis puts out in order to do everything else. So this slide has a star by it as well. Photosynthesis takes place in the green parts of the plant. So if we're talking about a plant, the leaf of this plant contains something called mesophyll tissue. And in this mesophyll tissue, cells containing something called chloroplasts are specialized to carry out photosynthesis. So the chloroplast is the green part of the plant that makes photosynthesis. So the raw materials for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O. So these next few bullet points are kind of like a flow of how this happens. So it starts by the roots absorbing the water from the ground. So when you water the plant, the roots absorb the water. That moves up this vascular tissue, so it moves up the stem. And then the carbon dioxide enters the leaf through small openings called stomata, the little small openings in leaves, stomata, and they diffuse or they move into the chloroplast in these mesophyll cells. So far, we've got water from the roots coming up the stem, CO2 going into the little openings called stomata. The CO2 that went into the stomata is now going into the chloroplast, and the chloroplast is located in the mesophyll. So then you've got thylakoid membranes of these chloroplasts. They contain something called chlorophyll and other pigments that can absorb the solar energy. So then electrons are energized in this process. So between the water going up the root, the CO2 coming into the stomata, then the CO2 leaving the stomata going into the chloroplast, which again is located in the mesophyll, and then we have thylakoid membranes in these chloroplasts that have something called chlorophyll. Electrons are getting energized throughout that whole process. Then CO2 is reduced. So here comes back that oil rig. Oxidation means it's lost. Reduction means it's gained. So CO2 is reduced to form a carbohydrate. In something called the stroma, CO2 combines with H2O to form C6H12O6, which is sugar. So if you remember from chapter 6, the slide that I had photosynthesis and cellular respiration on, we had CO2 and H2O and energy all came together to put out sugar or glucose. So that's just picture. All right, and there's a star beside this. So within photosynthesis, there's something called the light reactions and the dark reactions. So the light reactions only take place when there is light, like sunlight, present. They are energy capturing reactions. So remember, the sun puts off energy, which makes sense. If these only happen in the light, they can only happen when there's energy to be caught from the sun. So this chlorophyll absorbs, remember the chlorophyll is in the chloroplast, they absorb solar energy. And when they absorb that solar energy, they energize the little electrons that are in there. So then the electrons move down an electron transport chain. The electron transport chain pumps hydrogen ions, all that means, the H with the plus means hydrogen ion, into these thylakoids that are in the chloroplast. The electron transport chain then uses this to make ATP out of ADP, and then something called NADPH and NAD+. So this sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo until you actually see the cycle drawn in a circle, and then it'll start making sense. And with this stuff, I am going to find a YouTube video that explains it very well, since this lecture is not in person, so that you can see all of this in action and actually make some sense of this. So then there's something called the Calvin cycle reactions that take place in the stroma. So remember, the stroma is where that CO2 comes into. The stroma is the stromata is the little holes. So CO2 is then reduced to a carbohydrate. The reactions use the ATP and NADPH from the light reactions to produce a carbohydrate. So these it's called the Calvin cycle because a guy named Melvin Calvin figured it out, basically. So photosynthesis involves oxidation and reduction. So oil rig. Oxidation is the loss of and reduction of electrons. Reduction is the gain. So in photosynthesis, CO2, carbon dioxide, is reduced and water is oxidized. So CO2 gains electrons and water loses them. So these are just a few pictures. So this is another picture. This is a picture of photosynthesis. So you kind of got, well, here's the plant. Here's the stem I was talking about. There's the water. So here's the sun, thylakoid membrane in there, and that chloroplast. It's absorbing that. And then here's your water coming in the light reaction, putting out your O2. And here's this is why this doesn't make sense. So this was better explained in like a video or in person. And then there's your Calvin cycle. Remember, they're two different things, but you can see here they put out NADPH and ATP, run through, and put back. So they work together. So this has a star beside it as well. So plants convert solar energy. There's something called pigments in photosystems. Chemicals that absorb certain wavelengths of light are pigments, so like a pigment of light. And then wavelengths that are not absorbed by pigments are reflected. So that's why plants are green, because plants reflect green. They don't absorb it. So then there's an absorption spectrum. Pigments found in the chlorophyll absorb different portions of visible light. An absorption spectrum is a graph showing, the various colors of the rainbow is what that's saying. And then here it just says chlorophyll is green because it absorbs much of the reds and blues and it reflects green. That's all that's saying. That's the takeaway of that slide, is plants are green because. All right, there is a star on this slide. So this is talking about focusing on the light reactions of photosynthesis. So within the light reactions, we have non-cyclic and cyclic pathways. So let's back up. So overall umbrella term, photosynthesis. Then we have the light reactions, and then we have the Calvin cycle. So now we're focusing on just the light reactions, which then break down to non-cyclic and cyclic pathways. So the light reactions consist of two alternate electron pathways, non-cyclic and cyclic. So light reactions capture light energy with photosystems. So that's photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. And a photosystem is a pigment complex that helps collect solar energy, kind of like an antenna. So it's a photosystem, it's hanging out, let me get that pigment. So these are inside of the thylakoids. The thylakoids are inside of the inside of the chloroplasts. So you should be able to start seeing how all this comes together. So both cyclic and non-cyclic pathways produce ATP, they produce energy, but the non-cyclic pathway also produces NADPH, where the cyclic does not. So let's see, there's not a star beside this. So we are not gonna go over it. But, I mean, it just talks about non-cyclic takes place in the thylakoid, photosystem 1 and 2. Photosystem 2 captures light, ejects an electron, yada, yada, yada. But I don't think this is on your test, so we're going to skip over that for now. And when I find y'all a video of this, this will be in it. All right. So ATP production. All right, so I'm going to talk you through this, but I'm going to find you a video of this to make it make sense, since I can't draw it out for you. So ATP production. So how do we produce this ATP through this cycle? So the thylakoid space acts as a reservoir for hydrogen ions. So each time water is oxidized, so each time water loses an electron, 2 hydrogen ions remain in the thylakoid space. Sorry, I dropped my pen. So transfer of these electrons in this electron transport chain yields energy, which means it puts out energy, it produces it. This energy is used to pump hydrogen ions across the thylakoid membrane. So what that's saying is every time a redox reaction is happening in the thylakoid, that there are hydrogen ions hanging out waiting to be used. So the flow of hydrogen ions back across the thylakoid membrane is what energizes ATP synthase, which ATP synthase enzymatically produces ATP from ADP+. So all that is saying is ADP+ produces ATP. You know, all those fancy words, that's what it's saying. ADP+ produces ATP because hydrogen ions are flowing back across that thylakoid membrane. That's all that's saying. So this method of producing ATP is called chemoosmosis because ATP production is tied in with that hydrogen ion. So without those hydrogen ions, you're not going to be able to produce ATP from ADP. All right, so plants also fix carbon dioxide. So a cyclic series of reactions utilizes atmospheric CO2 to produce carbs. So that's what it means when it says it fixes carbon dioxide. That means it fixes it, turns it into a carb. So you have carbon dioxide fixation, carbon dioxide reduction, and RUBP regeneration. I'm not going to focus too much on that. So this slide has a star beside it, talking about the fixation of CO2. And I'm I said we weren't going to talk that much about it, but I do think we're going to talk just 3 slides about it. Not bad. Okay. So CO2 is attached to a 5-carbon RUBP by the enzyme RUBP carboxylase. Okay. Lots of words. Just focus. Don't focus on the words. Focus on the process. So when CO2 is attached to this 5-carbon RUBP, it results in a 6-carbon molecule. This then splits into 2 carbon molecules. The reaction is accelerated by RUBP carboxylase. Okay, so when something's accelerated, it's catalyzed, right? Get them enzymes, some catalysts. But RUBP carboxylase is also known as something called Rubisco. So CO2 is now fixed because it is a part of a carb. It's part of a carbohydrate. Okay. So CO2 attaches to this 5-carbon RUBP by Rubisco. So Rubisco is holding this CO2 and this 5-carbon RUBP together. Results, puts out 6-carbon. Then that 6-carbon molecule splits into 2 3-carbon molecules. So that would make sense. We're taking our 6-carbon molecule that our CO2 and our 5-carbon RUBP just came together and made, and we're going to split it again so we can fix this CO2. So half of 6 is 3, and you got 2 3s. So 3 PG, 3 carbon molecules. So again, CO2 is now fixed because it is a part of a carb. So this is what is called the Calvin cycle, which is what I'm working on explaining. or the fixation of carbon. And I feel like this is a lot to explain, so therefore it's better explained in a video where it draws it out. But if you back up, you can see where the 6 breaks down into the 3PG here, but we'll find us a video to watch that. Okay. All right, and this one has a star beside it. So then we're going to talk about the reduction of carbon. So that past slide was the fixation of carbon dioxide, excuse me. And now this is the reduction of carbon dioxide. So remember, when we're reducing something in a reaction, we are gaining electrons. So 3PG, which is what we just got out of our 6 carbon molecule, is then reduced to something called BPG. And then BPG is reduced again to something called G3P. So we're reducing all the way, and all of these electrons are being gained. So if you were to write it down, we would put CO2 attaches to RUBP. Those produce a 6 carbon molecule. Our 6 carbon molecule breaks down into 2 3 carbon molecules. Okay, and then this is where we pick up. Our 3 carbon molecule here is then broken down into something called BPG. And then our BPG is then further broken down into something called G3P. So if you were to write this linearly and number it 1 through whatever, you could see how these things go. And I mean, that's a good suggestion. You know, start by writing step 1, CO2 attached to 5 carbon RUBP. Step 2, 6 carbon molecule. Step 3, 2 3 carbon molecules. Step 4, 3 carbon molecule. Step 5, BPG. Step 6, G3P. So that's an example. So electrons and energy are required for this part. So this is the stage that utilizes NADPH and some ATP produced in the light reaction. So this is where our Calvin cycle is interacting with that light reaction, because it needs the NADPH and the ATP. Okay. So then the next part, we've got regeneration of that RUBP. So remember that RUBP is what attached to that CO2. So the RUBP that we used to attach to that CO2 has to be replaced. So we need to regenerate it. So every 3 turns of the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle is constantly turning, right? Turning clockwise. And every 3 times it goes through its process, 5 G3P, which was produced right here, 5 G3P, are used to remake 3 RUBP. So if you notice, we're building back up. So this G3P is a 3 carbon molecule, and that RUBP is a 5. So it's one big cycle, okay? And so here, if you were writing the steps, I don't remember what number I left off on, but this was our last step, was G3P. You would say your next step would to be, you would put, whatever step number, whatever you left off on, and then would say every 3 turns, and then you would go to the next step and say 5 G3P, used to remake 3 RUBP. Okay, and once we get back to this RUBP, we can pick up some more CO2 and keep it going. So the importance of the Calvin cycle is G3P, which, let's see if I can pronounce this, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. There you go. Could be converted to many other things. So the hydrocarbon skeleton of G3P can form fatty acids, glucose phosphate or simple sugars, fructose, starch and cellulose, and amino acids. There's not a star beside that, but So I would highly suggest, how I said, step 1, step 2, step 3, you write out the Calvin cycle that way, because you will be able to see it a lot better, at least for me. So that is it for chapter 7. And let's see if I want to make another video for chapter 8 or just keep going. So I'm going to make another video for chapter 8. And again, when I am done with all of these, I'm going to upload the YouTube videos to go with these cycles with these videos.